The silence of space was broken by the deafening roar of a massive battle. Alien warships, sleek and deadly, moved with precision as they exchanged fire in the darkness of the cosmos. Among the chaos, one ship stood out, a heavily armored vessel belonging to the alien queen. But despite its strength, the ship was no match for the rogue faction that had rebelled against her reign. The queen, a being of unimaginable power and intellect, sat at the helm, her ice cold as she commanded her forces. But even she could not foresee the betrayal that would tear her world apart. Her own fleet, once loyal, had turned against her. The battle raged on, the very fabric of space trembling as explosions rocked the ship. The queen's vessel was struck hard, sending shockwaves through the hull. Sparks flew, and alarms screamed as the control room was thrown into disarray. Her soldiers fought valiantly, but the rogue faction had prepared for this moment. With a fierce determination, the queen ordered her escape pod to be launched, knowing that survival was her only hope. As the pod blasted away from the wreckage of her once great ship, she watched helplessly as it crumbled, consumed by fire. The escape pod soared into the void of space, drifting away from the devastation, a single survivor of the fallen empire. Her pod was damaged, though. It spun out of control, its systems failing one by one as it descended toward an unknown planet. She tried to regain control, but the forces of nature were too strong. The pod plummeted through the atmosphere, fire trailing behind it, until it crashed violently into the earth below. For a moment, everything was black. The queen's vision blurred, her body battered by the crash. Her mind raced, still trying to make sense of what had happened. She had been a ruler, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Yet now she was nothing, stranded on a primitive world with no way to contact her people. She knew her life was in danger, but she couldn't help feeling something she had never felt before. Fear. Slowly, she regained her senses. Her body ached, and her vision began to clear. She opened her eyes to see nothing but trees and strange, unfamiliar shapes around her. The landscape was unlike anything she had ever seen. The air was thick with the scent of plants she didn't recognize, and the ground beneath her was soft with a strange texture. It was a world that seemed both wild and strangely peaceful. But she didn't have time to admire the view. The queen knew her enemies would not be far behind. She had been a target for so long, and now, stranded on this unknown planet, they would come for her. The rogue faction wouldn't hesitate to finish what they had started. As she struggled to her feet, her ears picked up the sound of movement. Something was approaching. Her heightened senses told her that it was not an alien force, but something far more human. Her mind was sharp, but she was weakened. She could sense the presence of a human, but she didn't know whether it was a soldier or a scavenger. Regardless, she was vulnerable, and she needed to act quickly. Her first instinct was to fight, but she realized that, in her current state, she wasn't in any condition to engage in combat. She needed to hide, to gather strength. The queen moved cautiously through the dense forest, her senses alert for any signs of danger, but the strange world had other plans. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees, tall, muscular, and armed. He appeared to be a soldier, but unlike any she had encountered before. His uniform was simple, practical, and looked nothing like the high-tech armor of the advanced alien warriors she was used to. The human, Bonner by name, had been patrolling the area when he spotted the crash site. He had no idea who or what the queen was. To him, she was just another survivor of a battle he had no part in. He was a soldier, trained to help those in need, and he saw someone in distress. Bonner's mission was clear: rescue and protect. His first reaction was to approach cautiously, weapon drawn, but he quickly saw that the figure in front of him was not a threat. She was injured, and from the look on her face, she was in pain. The queen's alien appearance didn't intimidate Bonner. Despite the many stories of terrifying creatures from distant stars, he had learned to approach each situation with logic. He knelt beside her, unsure of her origins, but knowing that help was the only option. "Are you all right?" Bonner asked, his voice calm and steady. His eyes scanned the Queen, noting the foreign symbols on her armor and the strange, otherworldly aura she emanated. The Queen looked up at him, confusion flooding her mind. She had been taught that humans were weak, primitive beings, not even worthy of notice. Yet here was one of them, offering help without hesitation. She wasn't used to this. Her entire life had been spent ruling, commanding others to do her bidding, not depending on anyone else. Yet in this moment, she was entirely at his mercy. Bonner could see she wasn't answering, so he acted quickly, trying to treat her wounds. His technology wasn't as advanced as hers, but he was resourceful. Using a medkit, he bandaged her injuries and gave her something to ease her pain. He didn't know who or what she was, but he wasn't going to leave her to die in the wilderness. The Queen's mind raced as she observed him. She had never considered the humanity of humans before. She had dismissed them as insignificant. But now, faced with this man's willingness to help her, her perception began to shift. Could this simple human really be trusted? Could he be different from the others she had encountered throughout her reign? As Bonner continued to tend to her, the Queen felt something stirring inside her, an emotion she had never allowed herself to feel. Gratitude. She was an alien queen, a being far superior to these humans in every way. But in this moment, she was indebted to him. The tension between them was palpable. The Queen, still suspicious, tried to push the thought aside. But for the first time in her life, she found herself wondering, what was it that made this human risk everything for someone like her? The Queen's survival now depended on him. And as she looked into his eyes, she realized that this human might be the key to her survival in this strange, unfamiliar world. Bonner sat beside the Queen, his fingers working quickly but carefully, applying bandages to the gash on her arm. His hands were steady, the years of training in combat and first aid taking over. Yet his mind was far from the task at hand. He had never encountered anyone like this before. Her alien features were striking, her skin a shade that no human could ever hope to replicate. Her eyes glowed with an intensity he could feel even without looking directly into them. There was something powerful about her, something that spoke of an intelligence far beyond his understanding. But despite all of this, he felt the need to help her. It was instinctual. It was who he was. The Queen, on the other hand, wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. For centuries, she had been in control, an empress of a vast empire, feared and respected by all who dared cross her path. Now she was at the mercy of a human. It irritated her, made her feel small, but more than that, it made her question everything she had ever known. Humans had always been beneath her. She had conquered their worlds, wiped out their colonies, treated them like insects under the boot of her empire. And yet here she was, a mere alien queen, wounded and weak, relying on one of them for survival. Her thoughts were a mix of confusion and frustration. She studied Bonner as he continued his work, his movements careful yet efficient. He wasn't like the soldiers she had seen in her battles. His uniform was simple, not the highly advanced armor of a military force from another star system. His equipment was primitive by her standards. And yet, he had managed to save her life. He had risked his own to help a stranger, an enemy. "Why are you helping me?" The Queen's voice was softer than she intended, her usual authority giving way to something unexpected. She hadn't planned on speaking, but the question slipped out before she could stop it. Bonner paused for a moment, his hand stilling over the bandage. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a brief moment. "I couldn't leave you out here to die," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. The Queen scoffed under her breath. "I am no one's charity case," she snapped, though her tone held more frustration than anger. She tried to sit up, ignoring the pain in her side. "I don't need your help." Bonner didn't flinch. "Maybe not," he said, continuing his work. "But that's not how I see it." The Queen didn't respond at first. She hated the feeling of being indebted to anyone, especially to a human. But the reality was undeniable. She had no other choice. Her ship was destroyed, her fleet scattered, and she was stranded on a planet with no way to communicate with her empire. Her once unshakable confidence had cracked, and she knew that if she didn't trust Bonner, her chances of survival were slim. But the tension between them was undeniable. The Queen couldn't help but feel suspicious. Bonner was offering help, but could she trust him? Was he truly a good person, or was he setting her up for some kind of trap? She didn't know enough about humans to make a decision, but the more she watched him, the more she began to wonder. There was something in his eyes, something that didn't seem to match the soldiers she had encountered before. It was genuine concern. It was strange, and yet she found herself unable to push it away. Bonner finished applying the bandages and then helped her sit up fully, offering her a small canteen of water. He didn't say anything at first, letting the silence hang between them. But when she took the water, he finally spoke again. "We need to get out of here. It's not safe to stay in the open for too long. If anything, comes looking for you, it's better if we're somewhere they can't find us." The Queen looked at him, her mind racing. She could sense something in his words, an urgency that matched the fear she had been trying to suppress. He was right. As much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't stay in one place for long. Her enemies wouldn't give up easily, and she had no idea who else might be out there, hunting her. "Lead the way," she said, her voice cold, but there was no denying the weariness in her tone. She wasn't used to depending on anyone, especially not a human. But right now, she didn't have a choice. Bonner gave her a nod, offering a hand to help her stand. She hesitated before taking it, her pride making the simple gesture feel like a concession she wasn't ready to make. But after a moment, she allowed herself to be helped up. The pain in her body was still intense, but the simple act of standing up gave her a sense of control. It reminded her that she wasn't completely powerless. As they moved through the dense forest, Bonner led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. The Queen, however, found herself studying him more closely now. She wasn't used to feeling so uncertain, and his calm demeanor was both puzzling and irritating. "How do you know where to go?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. She hadn't realized it before, but Bonner seemed to have a sense of direction, as though he knew this forest better than she had assumed. "I've been on this planet a while," he replied simply, his voice quiet but steady. "I know where to find shelter." The Queen didn't respond immediately. She wanted to ask him more, but the words caught in her throat. She was learning things about humans that didn't match her expectations. They weren't the simple, weak creatures she had been taught to believe they were. There was something more to them, something deeper. But she wasn't ready to admit that yet. She couldn't let herself trust him fully, not yet. After all, she was a queen, and even in her weakened state, her instincts told her to keep her guard up. The silence stretched between them as they moved deeper into the forest, and though the Queen's mind was still filled with suspicion, she couldn't shake the feeling that for the first time in her life, she was facing something she hadn't expected, a human who wasn't afraid to help her. The journey through the forest was long and tense. Bonner and the Queen moved carefully, every step taken with caution. The Queen's wounds slowed her down more than she wanted to admit, but she pushed through the pain, determined not to show weakness. She refused to rely on anyone, especially not a human. But deep down, she knew Bonner's help was the only reason she was still alive. As they continued their trek, the Queen noticed that Bonner was always scanning the area around them, his eyes constantly searching the shadows of the trees. His focus never wavered. Despite the fact that he was a soldier and probably didn't have advanced alien technology or the abilities that she had, his instincts were sharp. She could see the difference in the way he moved, quiet, controlled, alert. It made her think more about what kind of person Bonner truly was. "How much further?" the Queen asked, her voice betraying the weariness she felt. Bonner glanced back at her, his expression still calm. "Not much longer," he replied. "I know a place nearby. We'll be safe there." "Safe?" The word sounded so foreign to the Queen, and yet there was something in Bonner's voice that made her believe him. Despite her training and the countless battles she had fought, this situation was different. She didn't know what the future held, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't in control. That thought made her uncomfortable. The further they went, the more the Queen began to notice how different Bonner was from the soldiers she had once considered beneath her. Most humans, in her experience, were quick to fight, quick to take sides, and quick to give in to fear. But Bonner didn't seem like that at all. There was a calm strength to him that she couldn't quite place, a strength that didn't come from technology or weapons, but from something deeper, something human. When they reached a small clearing, Bonner stopped and pointed to a cluster of rocks and trees. "We'll rest here for the night," he said. "There's a stream nearby, and we can catch some food in the morning." The Queen looked around the area. It wasn't the grand palace she was used to, but it would do. The shelter was simple but practical, with enough cover to shield them from anyone who might be searching for them. She sat down on a rock and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to relax for the first time in what felt like days. The tension in her muscles began to ease, but her mind kept racing. "You're different," the Queen finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. "I've fought your kind for years, and you're nothing like the others." Bonner looked at her, surprised by her sudden admission. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice neutral but curious. "The others, your people, they're predictable," she said, her gaze focused on the ground in front of her. "They act out of fear, out of a desire for power. They fight because they're weak. But you?" She looked up at him, her alien eyes searching his face. "You're not like that." "Why?" Bonner was quiet for a long moment. He hadn't expected her to ask such a question, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that her question made sense. Why had he helped her? Why had he risked his life for an alien queen who had once ordered the death of his people? "I guess I don't believe in killing just because it's easy," he said finally. "Maybe I've seen too much death in my time. The thing is, we're all just people. Everyone has a story, a reason for what they do. I don't know why you attacked Earth, and maybe I'll never understand. But that doesn't mean I can't help you." The Queen frowned. "Help me," she repeated. "Why would you help me?" Bonner's gaze softened. "Because we're all in this together now. The world's changed, and I think we both know that. I don't know what'll happen in the future, but right now, we have a chance. A chance to make things right." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what to believe. She had been raised to think of humans as nothing more than a nuisance, a species to be controlled or eliminated. Yet here she was, sitting in the dirt, injured and vulnerable, and a human soldier was offering to help her. It didn't make sense. "You're making a mistake," she muttered, looking away. "If the rest of my people knew this, knew that I'm depending on a human for help, they would never allow it." Bonner sat down on a large boulder near her, leaning back and staring up at the sky. "Maybe so," he said, his voice calm. "But maybe they'll be wrong. Maybe this alliance, this strange partnership, will be the only way for both our peoples to survive." The Queen scoffed at the thought. "Alliance?" she asked. "You think I'm going to trust a human?" Bonner smiled, but it wasn't a smug or arrogant smile. It was genuine. "I think you're starting to." The Queen's thoughts were in turmoil. Could she trust him? Was Bonner telling the truth? She had seen the way he moved, the way he protected her. There was something honest about him. Something that made her wonder if there was more to humanity than she had ever realized. For a moment, she allowed herself to think about the possibility of an alliance, the idea that their fates might be linked in ways they couldn't even understand. The thought was both frightening and comforting. But before she could voice her thoughts, she was interrupted by the sound of a distant explosion. Her heart raced as she stood up, instinctively reaching for a weapon she didn't have. Bonner, however, remained calm, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to move," he said, urgency in his voice. They found us. Without another word, the Queen and Bonner quickly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. Their brief moment of peace was shattered, but they both knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger. An unexpected alliance had formed between them, one that would change the course of their lives forever. As they left the safety of the clearing, their bond was stronger than ever. There was no turning back now. Together, they would face whatever came next, and for the first time in a long time, the Queen felt a spark of hope. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. As the Queen and Bonner raced through the dense forest, the distant sound of explosions and gunfire echoed all around them. It was clear that the forces after them were closing in. The Queen's heart pounded in her chest, not just from the fear of being caught, but also from the strange feeling that Bonner's presence was somehow calming her. She had never felt this before, not even in the most intense battles. They had only just formed an alliance, and already their world was crashing down. Their enemies, the advanced alien forces, were relentless, and the human soldiers who had once feared them were now the hunted. Yet Bonner, the human soldier, showed no fear. His steps were steady, his gaze focused, and he never once looked back to see how close their enemies were. He trusted in the plan and the Queen. As they ran, the Queen noticed the small tactical device on Bonner's wrist blinking. It was a communication tool he had used earlier to send warnings to his base. Now the screen showed a map of the nearby area. The last known positions of the alien forces were marked in red, closing in from every direction. "There's no escape through the woods," Bonner said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We'll have to head to the old ruins on the other side of the valley. It's the only place we'll stand a chance." The Queen nodded. Her mind raced. The ruins were a dangerous place to be, filled with traps and ancient alien technologies. But they had no choice. It was their only option to fight back. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The Queen, despite her injuries, kept up with Bonner, her mind sharp and focused. Her once proud alien instincts were now intertwined with Bonner's human ingenuity, and she realized something she never thought possible. She had started to trust him. She had always believed that trust was a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited, but here she was, relying on Bonner to lead them to safety. As they approached the ruins, the air seemed to hum with energy. The Queen couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The ancient stones around them were covered in alien symbols, and the technology embedded in the walls seemed to pulse with life. Bonner paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "They're getting closer," he muttered. "We have to make our move now." Without another word, Bonner led the Queen into the heart of the ruins. The deep stone corridors were dark and filled with shadows, and the quiet hum of ancient machines resonated through the walls. They moved quickly, knowing they had little time before their enemies caught up to them. Suddenly, the ground shook. The Queen's senses flared, and she instinctively reached for her weapon. But Bonner held up his hand to stop her. "They're here," Bonner whispered. "We need to split up. I'll draw them away from you, and you find the core. If we can destroy their power source, we can win." The Queen hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Be careful, human," she said, her voice laced with genuine concern. "I'll do my part." Bonner gave her a grim smile before disappearing into the darkness of the ruins. The Queen, now alone, made her way deeper into the maze of stone. The walls were lined with strange devices and relics, remnants of a long-forgotten civilization. But her mind was focused on one thing, the core. If she could destroy the power source, she could turn the tide of the battle. She moved with precision, her senses alert for any sign of danger. But as she neared the central chamber, she felt the weight of the situation press down on her. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a battle for their future, a future where the Queen could see humans and aliens standing together, side by side. But in order for that to happen, they both needed to survive. She couldn't afford to fail. Not now. When she finally reached the core, she saw the glowing energy source that powered the entire facility. It pulsed with a soft, ominous light. The Queen's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. But before she could react, she heard Bonner's voice crackle over her communicator. "It's now or never," he shouted. "I've got their attention. You've got to destroy the core." The Queen didn't hesitate. She knew this was their last chance. With a swift movement, she activated the device on her wrist, triggering a pulse that resonated through the core. The energy around her crackled, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had slowed down. The Queen could feel the heat of the explosion building, but she didn't move. She stayed focused on the mission. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet rumbled, and the ruins began to shake. The core had been activated, and now there was no turning back. From the shadows, Bonner appeared, running toward her. "It's done," he shouted. "We've won." But before they could celebrate, the alien forces arrived. A massive fleet of warships appeared in the sky above the ruins, their weapons aimed directly at the pair. The battle was far from over. But the Queen felt a strange sense of calm. She had done her part. She had trusted Bonner, and together they had accomplished what seemed impossible. As the alien forces descended upon them, the Queen and Bonner prepared for the final showdown. With the core destroyed, they had dealt a crippling blow to their enemies. But the war was far from over. The Queen knew that this was only the beginning of a long, hard fight. However, for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. Bonner stood by her side, ready to face whatever came next. And no matter what happened, they would fight together, side by side, to the very end. The final battle had just begun, but with their alliance, they now had a chance to win. Together, they would face the darkness and prove that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity and trust could prevail. The aftermath of the battle felt like a quiet storm. The ruins were still smoldering, the once powerful alien warships now scattered wrecks across the sky, their massive hulls torn apart by the explosion. The Earth had won, but at what cost? The weight of the destruction hung in the air, and the silence that followed the chaos felt unnatural. Bonner stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was covered in dirt, sweat, and blood, but his expression was one of grim satisfaction. He had made it through, and so had the Queen. But something lingered in the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. They had won a major victory, yes, but the war was far from over. Beside him, the Queen seemed lost in thought. Her regal appearance had been tarnished by the fight, but there was a new light in her eyes, a mix of respect and understanding. She had never thought much of humanity. To her, humans were a primitive species, struggling to survive in a galaxy that had long since moved past them. But now, after everything they had been through, she saw humans in a new light. Bonner, in particular, had become more than just a soldier. He had become an ally, someone she could trust. She turned her gaze to Bonner, her voice low but steady. "This is only the beginning, isn't it?" Bonner didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the battlefield. His mind raced as he processed everything that had happened. They had crippled the alien fleet, destroyed the core that powered their enemies, and made a powerful statement that humanity would not be defeated. But that didn't mean the fight was over. There would be other battles, other forces coming for Earth and its allies. The Alien Council would not give up easily, and there were still many unknowns about the true extent of the alien powers they had faced. He turned to her, his eyes hard. "No, it's just the start." The Queen nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had seen firsthand what humans were capable of. The battle they had just fought together was proof that humans were no longer weak and helpless in the grand scheme of the galaxy. They were fighters, survivors, and if they were going to face the Council again, they would need every advantage they could get. "We need to regroup," the Queen said, her voice steady. "There are other fleets, other enemies who will come for us. We must be ready." Bonner gave a sharp nod. "I'll get word to the Earth forces. They need to know what happened here and that we have a chance to fight back. We can't waste any time.